There is a small neighborhood in Brooklyn where men in black coats walk to synagogue on Saturday morning, where grandmothers argue over whose chicken soup needs more dill, where the same families have been living, praying, eating, and burying their dead within a few square blocks for 4 or 5 generations. If you walked through Williamsburg or Borough Park on a weekday afternoon, you would see something that demographers find genuinely puzzling. You would see old people. Not old people in care facilities, not old people being managed by medical staff, but old people out in the world, walking, arguing, cooking, studying, holding grandchildren, running businesses, vigorous, engaged, present. 85-year-old men who still walk to morning prayers every day. 90-year-old women who still run their own kitchens. The kind of old age that most people in the developed world have quietly stopped expecting. This is not a coincidence, and it is not genetics alone. Across multiple countries, multiple cultural subgroups, and multiple socioeconomic conditions, Jewish populations consistently show life expectancy figures that outpace their national averages by a margin that researchers have struggled to fully explain. Israeli Jews live longer than the OECD average, despite living in one of the most geopolitically stressed countries on Earth. American Jewish men live several years longer than the American male average. The longevity gap is real, it is documented, and it is not explained by income or access to health care alone, because the pattern holds even when those variables are controlled for. Something else is happening. Something in the culture, in the daily practices, in the way Jewish communities structure time and food and relationships and meaning, is producing lifespans that the rest of the world is still trying to catch up to. Today, we're going to break it down, not as a spiritual mystery, not as a genetic lottery, but as a system of daily practices rooted in thousands of years of Jewish tradition that happen to align almost perfectly with what modern longevity science has spent the last 50 years figuring out. Let's get into it. To understand why Jewish communities developed the health practices they did, you have to understand something about the relationship between Jewish law and the human body. In most religious traditions, the body and the soul are treated as separate concerns. The soul is the spiritual domain of religion, while the body is a secular or medical matter. Jewish tradition takes a fundamentally different position. The concept of shmirat haguf, guarding the body, is a religious obligation, not a personal preference. The Talmud states explicitly that a person is forbidden to harm their own body, because the body is not entirely their own. It is entrusted to them by God, and they have a duty to return it in the best possible condition. The implications of this framing are enormous: diet, sleep, exercise, stress management, community connection. These are not lifestyle choices in Jewish tradition. They are religious duties, and religious duties embedded in daily practice and community reinforcement get followed with a consistency that personal motivation alone almost never achieves. When your doctor tells you to eat better, you try for 2 weeks. When your tradition has been telling you to eat better for 3,000 years, the behavior gets embedded in the culture at a level that doesn't require individual motivation at all. It just becomes what people do. That structural difference between a health practice that requires ongoing personal willpower and one that is simply part of how your community lives is perhaps the most underappreciated factor in Jewish longevity. The first and most documented practice is the Jewish dietary system, kashrut, the laws of keeping kosher. Now, most people's understanding of kosher stops at no pork and no shellfish, which misses about 90% of what the system actually involves. The full kashrut system is a comprehensive framework for food selection, preparation, and consumption that has significant and well-documented health implications. The prohibition on pork eliminated a major historical source of trichinella and other parasitic infections in an era before refrigeration or food safety regulation. The prohibition on shellfish, filter feeders that concentrate heavy metals, bacteria, and environmental toxins, removed another significant category of foodborne illness risk. The requirement that meat be slaughtered in a specific manner, inspected for signs of disease, and thoroughly drained of blood eliminated the consumption of diseased animals and significantly reduced bacterial contamination. And the separation of meat and dairy, requiring separate preparation, separate cookware, and a waiting period of several hours between consuming them, effectively divided meals into either protein-focused or dairy-focused categories, which modern nutritional research suggests may improve digestive efficiency and reduce the kind of heavy, mixed macronutrient meals associated with metabolic strain. Here's what makes this really fascinating from a longevity perspective. The health benefits of kashrut are almost entirely a byproduct of a system designed for spiritual and ethical reasons, not medical ones. The rabbis who codified these laws over 2,000 years ago were not nutritional scientists. They were legal scholars working from religious texts. And yet the system they produced, when evaluated against modern food science, performs remarkably well as a health-protective dietary framework. Think of it like this. Imagine hiring a nutritionist to design your family's food system, paying them for 3,000 years of consultations, and then discovering that the religious tradition you were already following had arrived at most of the same conclusions independently and embedded them in practices so deeply culturally reinforced that compliance is essentially automatic. That's kashrut, the most effective dietary intervention most nutritionists have never credited. The second practice is Shabbat, the weekly Sabbath, and its relationship to longevity is more direct than most people realize. From Friday at sundown to Saturday at nightfall, observant Jewish families stop. Not slow down. Stop. No work, no commerce, no screens, no financial decisions, no driving, no cooking from scratch. The preparation happens beforehand. The table is set, the candles are lit, the wine is poured, the family gathers. And for 25 hours, the pace of modern life simply ceases. Now, in the context of longevity science, this practice maps almost precisely onto what researchers studying blue zones, the regions of the world with the highest concentrations of people over 100, identify as one of the most consistent predictors of long life, a regular, culturally enforced period of rest and stress reduction. The Seventh-day Adventists of Loma Linda, California, one of the 5 blue zones identified by researcher Dan Bietner, observe a Saturday Sabbath with remarkable similarity to Jewish Shabbat practice, and they live on average 10 years longer than their American neighbors. The researchers noted the Sabbath specifically as a likely contributing factor. The physiology behind this is well established. Chronic stress is one of the most reliable accelerators of cellular aging, operating through multiple mechanisms including elevated cortisol, telomere shortening, and chronic low-grade inflammation. A weekly enforced period of stress reduction, not just attempted relaxation, but a culturally mandated, socially reinforced full stop, interrupts the chronic stress cycle in a way that individual relaxation attempts almost never achieve. You cannot fully decompress if you know you could be working. When the culture, the community, and the religious law all say you cannot work, the decompression is complete. And complete decompression, 52 times a year for an entire lifetime, produces measurable physiological benefits that accumulate over decades the same way compound interest accumulates in a savings account, slowly, invisibly, and then quite dramatically. The third practice is the Shabbat meal itself, and it represents something that longevity researchers have identified as one of the most powerful and most overlooked factors in long life. Every Friday night, in Jewish homes around the world, families gather around a table for a meal that is specifically designed to be unhurried, socially rich, and centered on connection rather than consumption. The meal begins with blessings. It moves through wine, bread, multiple courses, conversation, and often singing. It lasts for hours, and it happens every single week, 52 times a year, for a lifetime. What this practice produces, consistent, face-to-face, multi-generational family connection in a context of warmth, ritual, and shared identity, is precisely what social scientists have identified as one of the strongest independent predictors of longevity in the entire research literature. The Harvard study of adult development, the longest-running longitudinal study of human well-being ever conducted, followed men from their teens into old age for over 80 years and found that the single strongest predictor of healthy aging was not diet, not exercise, not income, not genetics. It was the quality of close relationships. Shabbat dinner is a technology for producing exactly that. A weekly, mandatory, culturally reinforced hour of quality relationship investment, so deeply embedded in the community that no one has to decide to do it. It simply happens, the same way the sun sets every Friday. The fourth practice involves something that sounds almost comically simple, but has remarkable scientific support: regular communal prayer. 3 times a day, observant Jewish men gather for minyan, the quorum of 10 required for certain prayers. This means leaving the house, walking to synagogue, standing and sitting and bowing in a structured physical routine, and spending time in community with other people, every morning, every afternoon, every evening. Now, here's what makes this interesting from a health perspective. Each of those 3 elements, regular physical activity, structured breathing practices, and consistent social engagement, independently predicts lower mortality risk in the epidemiological literature. The daily walk to synagogue provides what researchers call non-exercise activity thermogenesis, the low-intensity physical movement that, when accumulated across a lifetime, has been shown to predict longevity outcomes better than formal exercise in several large studies. The structured prayer itself, with its rhythmic recitation and controlled breathing, produces physiological effects similar to what meditation researchers call the relaxation response: reduced heart rate, lower cortisol, decreased inflammatory markers, and the consistent social contact multiple times daily prevents the social isolation that has been identified as equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day in its effect on mortality risk. Jewish men who attend daily minyan are, without necessarily knowing it, performing a 3 times daily intervention that addresses physical activity, stress physiology, and social connection simultaneously, and they've been doing it for centuries. The 5th practice is the Jewish approach to fasting, specifically Yom Kippur and the 4 other fast days on the Jewish calendar. Modern longevity research has generated enormous excitement around the concept of intermittent fasting and caloric restriction as mechanisms for extending healthy lifespan, operating through a cellular cleanup process called autophagy and through reduced oxidative stress. The annual Yom Kippur fast, 25 hours of complete abstention from food and water, represents one of the most physiologically significant fasting events in any mainstream religious tradition. 5 complete fasts per year, practiced consistently across an entire community for a lifetime, produces cumulative exposure to autophagy-inducing caloric restriction that some researchers believe may contribute measurably to the cellular health of long-term observers. The science of fasting as a longevity intervention is still developing, but what is clear is that Jewish communities have been practicing it systematically for religious reasons for thousands of years before the first intermittent fasting paper was ever published. The practice found the science rather than the science finding the practice. The 6th practice is one of the most elegant in the entire system, and it involves the Jewish relationship with alcohol. Jewish culture has a deeply ambivalent, carefully structured relationship with drinking. Wine is central to almost every religious ritual: Shabbat, holidays, the Passover Seder, circumcisions, weddings, the Havdalah ceremony that ends Shabbat. Alcohol is present everywhere in Jewish ritual life. And yet, rates of alcoholism and alcohol-related disease in Jewish communities are among the lowest of any ethnic group in the developed world. The reason, researchers believe, is the ritualization of alcohol consumption. In Jewish practice, wine is almost always consumed in a religious context, with specific blessings, in specific quantities, in the company of family, at a table. It is embedded in a framework of meaning and community that makes mindless, escapist drinking culturally alien. Drinking alone is essentially antithetical to the contexts in which Jewish tradition places alcohol. The glass of wine at the Shabbat table, consumed with blessing and in community, is a profoundly different psychological act than the glass of wine poured alone at the end of a stressful day. The alcohol may be identical. The context, and therefore the pattern of use that context produces, is entirely different. Ritualization as harm reduction. 3,000 years before public health researchers started talking about relationship with alcohol, Jewish tradition had embedded a healthy one. The 7th practice addresses something that modern medicine has only recently begun to take seriously as a health variable: the relationship between purpose and physical health. The concept of Torah Lishma, studying for its own sake as a lifelong obligation, means that in traditional Jewish communities, the act of learning never stops. Men who have been in business their entire lives attend Talmud study classes in their 70s. Women gather for classes on Jewish law and thought well into old age. The Beit Midrash, the house of study, is populated at every age. This lifelong engagement with complex intellectual material has a direct physiological correlate. Epidemiological studies consistently find that people who maintain high levels of intellectual engagement in later life have significantly lower rates of cognitive decline, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease than those who do not. The mechanism appears to involve what neurologists call cognitive reserve, the brain's accumulated capacity to tolerate damage without showing symptoms, built up through years of complex mental activity. Talmudic study, with its requirement to hold multiple competing arguments in mind simultaneously, to reason from first principles, to engage with dense and layered texts, is one of the most cognitively demanding regular activities a person can undertake. Jewish men, who have been doing it for 60 years, enter old age with cognitive reserves that most of their contemporaries simply cannot match. The eighth practice is one that longevity researchers discovered, were somewhat surprised by, and then found confirmed repeatedly across different populations and contexts. It is the practice of regular ritual immersion, specifically the mikveh, the ritual bath used by observant Jewish women after menstruation and by both men and women at various points in the religious calendar. Setting aside the spiritual dimension entirely, the mikveh practice produces an interesting health byproduct. It creates a regular, structured rhythm of physical intimacy in Jewish marriages that is built around anticipation and renewal rather than routine and habituation. Studies of marital satisfaction and physical intimacy in observant Jewish couples have found rates of marital stability and reported satisfaction that significantly exceed national averages. And the connection between marital quality and longevity is one of the most robustly documented findings in the entire social epidemiology literature. Married people live longer than unmarried people. Happily married people live longer than unhappily married people. The gap is large enough to be physiologically significant, operating through stress pathways, immune function, health behavior, and social support. If Jewish ritual practice produces higher average marital quality, and multiple studies suggest it does, then the longevity benefit that flows from that is real and measurable. The ninth practice might seem counterintuitive until you look at the data. It is the Jewish practice of mourning, specifically the Shiva, the 7-day mourning period during which the bereaved family stays home, receives visitors, and is supported by the community in a highly structured way. The community brings food, the mirrors are covered, the bereaved sit low to the ground and receive condolence visits from anyone who wishes to come. And for 7 days, grief is given full cultural permission to exist. This matters for longevity because suppressed grief, the kind that gets managed with a return to normal life within 48 hours, with a quiet expectation of moving on, is a significant physiological stressor. Unprocessed grief elevates cortisol, disrupts sleep, suppresses immune function, and is associated with increased mortality risk in the year following bereavement. The Shiva is essentially a cultural technology for processed grief, a structured, community-supported container in which loss is fully acknowledged, socially witnessed, and given the time and space it requires. The community then continues to support the bereaved through Shloshim, the 30-day period, and through the 11-month Kaddish obligation, during which the mourner recites a specific prayer 3 times daily, which incidentally means attending minyan 3 times daily, meaning social contact 3 times daily, during exactly the period when social isolation poses the greatest mortality risk to the bereaved. The Jewish mourning system is, from a public health perspective, one of the most well-designed grief support protocols ever developed, and it has been operating continuously for roughly 3,000 years. The 10th practice is perhaps the most systemic of all, because it operates at the community level rather than the individual level, and it produces health benefits that no amount of individual behavior change could fully replicate. It is the Jewish concept of communal responsibility for every member's welfare, expressed through institutions like the Gemach, the communal society, the Chevra Kadisha, and the hundreds of informal support networks that exist in any functioning Jewish community. Social isolation is, as we've noted, one of the most reliable predictors of early mortality in the epidemiological literature. It operates through multiple biological pathways: immune dysregulation, cardiovascular stress, sleep disruption, and the simple failure of anyone to notice when something is wrong. In a functioning Jewish community, social isolation is structurally nearly impossible. You are expected at minyan, your absence is noticed. The community checks on you. The Gemach exists to help you through financial crisis. The Chevra Kadisha will care for your body when you die and support your family when you cannot. The Shabbat table means that even if you live alone, there is a standing invitation to join someone else's family every week. The infrastructure of care is baked into the community's design, not left to the voluntary kindness of individuals. And the health outcomes of that infrastructure are real, documented, and enormous. When you compare the conventional modern approach to health and longevity with the Jewish communal approach, the contrast is instructive. Most people in the developed world approach health as an individual project. Personal diet choices, personal exercise regimens, personal stress management techniques, pursued alone and maintained through individual willpower. The Jewish system approaches health as a communal infrastructure, practices embedded in ritual, reinforced by community, maintained by cultural expectation rather than personal motivation, and distributed across every domain of life simultaneously. The individual doesn't need to decide to eat more carefully if kashrut has structured their food environment since birth. The individual doesn't need to schedule a weekly rest if Shabbat enforces it, regardless of how busy the week gets. The individual doesn't need to seek out social connection if minyan, Shabbat dinner, and the communal calendar provide it automatically 3 times a day. Most people need to build healthy habits against the grain of their environment. In a functioning Jewish community, the environment itself is the healthy habit. That is an almost insurmountable advantage over a lifetime. Here's the overlooked gem in all of this, and it is probably the most transferable insight in the entire video. The common thread running through every single Jewish longevity practice we've discussed, from kashrut to Shabbat to Shiva to daily minyan, is that none of them were designed as health interventions. They were designed as religious and ethical practices, and health turned out to be a byproduct. What that tells us is something remarkable about the relationship between meaning and physical well-being. People who have a clear reason to do something, a reason that transcends personal preference, that is embedded in community and tradition and identity, do it consistently for decades without requiring motivation. And consistent practices, maintained for decades, produce outcomes that no short-term intervention can replicate. The single most actionable idea in all of this is not to adopt a specific Jewish practice. It is to find the practices that matter to you and embed them in your community and your calendar so deeply that they no longer require a decision. Make the healthy choice the default choice. Build the infrastructure so the behavior follows automatically. That is precisely what Jewish tradition did for every health practice we've discussed across 3,000 years of real-world testing in real communities facing real challenges. The results speak for themselves, from the dietary framework of kashrut to the weekly reset of Shabbat, from the communal architecture of daily minyan to the structured grief processing of Shiva. Jewish communities demonstrate something that modern medicine is only beginning to fully appreciate, that longevity is not primarily a medical achievement, it is a cultural one. It is what happens when a community's values, rituals, relationships, and daily practices are aligned over a very long time with what human beings actually need to thrive. In a world where chronic disease, social isolation, and stress-driven illness have become the default outcomes of modern life, the Jewish system offers not a set of tips, but a complete alternative architecture for how a human life can be structured. If you've found value in exploring how Jewish traditions approach health and longevity, subscribe for more deep dives into the wisdom of communities that have been building resilient lives for generations. If you've got your own experience with any of these practices, share it in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. And if there's one idea worth taking from all of this, build your environment so the right choice requires no decision at all.